This is Join Us in France, Episode 3. Hello, I'm Annie.
And I'm Elise. And we welcome you to the Join Us in France podcast, the show where we share the best of France.
Elise is a professional tour guide and art historian. And this is the podcast where we help you prepare your trip to France and share with you everything you need to know to have a great time in France. On today's show, we're going to be talking about the Sainte Chapelle, the marvelous church on the Ile de la Cité. On joinusinfrance.com, you will find our show notes, and we'll hope you'll visit and say hello, and we'll have some questions for you there. And now, a little music to get us in the mood, and then we'll jump right into it. Hello, Elise. How are you today?
I am fine, Annie. How are you?
Good. I'm happy that we're back. And today we are going to talk about
the Sainte Chapelle.
Sainte Chapelle. Definitely one of the best places not to be missed in Paris.
Yeah, you know what? It's really interesting because it's not on everybody's best known list of the things that they identify with Paris, but it certainly is one of the most beautiful things you can possibly see when you visit the city of Paris. What are we talking about? The Sainte Chapelle. Well, what we're talking about is a small church, a chapel, that was the private property of a French king. And it was a king who has since come to be called Saint Louis. And he was actually Louis the Ninth. You know, in France, there were lots of Louis. They have Louis going all the way up through the 17th and the 18th, actually. This place, which is famous for its stained glass and for the gorgeous colors of the stained glass, it was built by order of the king, this king, St. Louis, who in fact was able to acquire through a long, devious process, but it's actually rather fascinating because we're talking about basically 800 years ago. All right, almost 800 years ago. And what happened was, this is, of course, the King of France, who was very, very powerful and very rich. And he was able, in a deal, if you want to call it that, to get a hold of the crown of thorns that had been held in Jerusalem for quite a long time. Now, has it been authenticized? Somebody listening might want to know, is this genuinely the real crown of thorns?
That was on Jesus' head.
That was on Jesus' head, right. I quite honestly would not be able to tell you. However, it is really verifiable that it had been in the hands of the Crusaders in Jerusalem for centuries and centuries and centuries. And going back as far as possible, it was considered to be really from the time of when Jesus was alive. So the people at that time in the 1200s certainly believed that it was the genuine crown of thorns. And the King of France, who was a very devout Catholic, he was able to acquire it, literally buy it, and in order to have a very good place to show it, to create a sanctuary that would be worthy of it, he asked the architects and the wonderful stained glass makers who had just finished the Cathedral of Chartres, which is just a little bit outside of Paris, to come and build this special chapel for him and his family only. And it was attached to his palace on the Ile de la Cité. And they built the entire structure, including all of these fabulous windows that I'm going to tell you about, in a very short time, considering, and that was 30 years. Of course, by today's standards, we would never take 30 years to build anything. We build things very quickly. But we're talking about a time when everything was done by hand. And what did he want? Well, he wanted a place that was going to be gorgeous and worthy of worship. And in those days, because we're in the height of the times when Gothic architecture is very, very important. Gothic architecture basically is architecture that is very vertical, and where windows and stained glass color, actual color, is extremely important because people believed that light and color was an opening into paradise. Isn't that lovely? We have this wonderful structure that is still intact from those days. It was finished in the 1250s. It was started in the 1220s, And what happened was we have a structure that was designed at first specifically only for the royal family, but of course you have the court, and the court was able to come in by invitation of the king. So what did he have done? He asked the stained glass makers to make a chapel that was 3/4 glass and very, very little solid wall. He wanted the most beautiful color and light to come in. And so what we have to this day is a structure that has over 1,100 panels of stained glass.
Wow.
And now, when we're talking right now, 740 of those panels are still the original panels, 800 years pretty much later. And when you take a look at them, as you know, you've been there yourself, it is just fabulous, absolutely fabulous. And of course, if you have the luck of going in there on a sunny day, it's really like walking into paradise.
It is.
It really is. It's just filled with the most amazing little pieces, thousands and thousands of pieces of intense saturated colored glass that tell stories, because these are windows that all tell stories from the Bible, either the Old Testament or the New Testament. But now, what is the real interest in going there? Well, I would say the real interest in going there is to see how people were able to build something so fabulous 800 years ago, having just hand tools, cutting pieces of glass, putting them together with lead wiring around them, building a structure that is extremely high so that the windows themselves are 15 meters tall, and they are still intact after all these years. And one of the things about stained glass from that time, particularly in the northern part of France, is that they had a secret formula, secret recipe that we still cannot reproduce. So the stained glass makers, they made the glass with the reds and the blues and the greens and the yellows in the silicate mix, so that when they created the glass, the color was in the glass. And they did not know how to make big pieces, big sheets of glass. That's why there were zillions of little pieces. But also, they were inspired, believe it or not, by Roman mosaics. And Roman mosaics, of course, as we all know, a mosaic is made up of many, 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 many tiny, tiny little pieces. In this case, using extremely rich color, and putting them all together gives this great wonder world kind of feeling to it. So it's a great place to visit.
It's like walking into a kaleidoscope.
It is exactly that. It is exactly like walking into a kaleidoscope. And if you have the time to spend at least an hour, which most people don't because it's not that big, but if you spend an hour inside there and the light changes on the outside, you can see how the colors shift and move around. And it is just glorious. It's absolutely glorious. Now, what's really interesting is that since they've been modernizing all of these monuments and making them more and more tourist and user-friendly, they now have a video set up upstairs in the higher part of the chapel, which is where the stained glass windows are, that shows you how they actually take out the pieces of glass to clean them up and renovate them. And they do that slowly but surely, a little bit at a time, all the time, so that it stays in perfect condition. And just a little anecdote, in case you didn't know this, people sometimes wonder and ask me, how come these windows are still there? Because, of course, Paris was occupied by the Germans during World War II. Well, the reason why these windows are still there is that, just like in Chartres, they actually took them out.
Oh, wow.
They took the windows out and they took them down without breaking the windows, and they took them out section by section and they stored them away.
That's amazing. I looked it up while you were talking. 15 meters. You said they're 15 meters tall. That's 50 feet.
That's 50 feet.
50 feet.
Yeah.
So these are massive windows.
These are massive windows. And of course, it's a structure that is unbelievable because it almost feels like the sections of solid wall in between the glass are barely strong enough to hold it up. Luckily, it's not a place that has a lot of wind, so they don't have to worry about it. It is just a marvelous place. And of course, ironically enough, the upper part where all this gorgeous stained glass is, and it's considered to be not only the most beautiful collection of stained glass ever anywhere, even more than in Chartres because of the quality of it. But right now, it is the oldest stained glass in Paris. Being careful to precisely say in Paris. Down below, when you go into the chapel, you have a space that has no windows. It's actually holding up the upper structure where the windows are. It's covered with gorgeous gold and beautiful blue and red. But it was for the people. And a lot of fleur-de-lis, of course, and a lot of fleur-de-lis to show that it belonged to the King of France. And it's the space where royal, noble people were invited to come who were not privileged enough to be invited upstairs to the chapel. And it was in the midst of all of these windows that St. Louis created a sanctuary made out of wood to house the crown of thorns.
Is it still there?
It is not there anymore. No, it is not there. It is buried in the lowest part of the crypt inside the Cathedral of Notre Dame, and it is not open to be seen by the public anymore. Only specialists are allowed to go in and see it. But it's still around. It's still on the Ile de la Cité. So it's really connected to the ancient history of Paris.
I think they want to keep a lot of mystery around all these reliquaries having to do with Jesus. And,
Well, it's a mysterious place, between Notre Dame and Sainte Chapelle. There is a lot of mystery. And, of course, Paris is a very, very ancient city. And the mysteries of treasures and the mysteries of things that happened in the medieval times, well, it's part of the story that keeps people coming back to places like that.
So let's get back to some practical points. How do you get to Sainte Chapelle?
Well, Sainte Chapelle is one of the major monuments on Ile de la Cité. As we mentioned in another podcast, it's really easy to get to. You have access by metro. You have a metro stop that's literally right across the street from it called the Cité. It's one of the metro lines. There are many, many metro lines in Paris. You have two other metro stops not very far away on either side of the river. You have Saint-Michel, Notre Dame on one side. On the right bank, you have Châtelet. You also have buses that go across the island and that stop on both sides of the island and across. And you can walk across if you are staying nearby on either side. It's relatively flat. You buy a ticket. You have to pay. Sainte Chapelle is €8 per person, and it's €5 for under 18 if you are with children. So you do have to pay an entry. If you want to do a combined entry with the conciergerie, which is something we mentioned very briefly in another podcast, but we'll talk about it another time, you can actually do a combined ticket entrance to two if you do them both on the same day for €11. So if you're interested in doing both, it is a good deal. Once you go inside, you have to go through a security check. Very interesting. Number one, you have to go through a security check because right now in Paris, most major monuments do require a security check, but also Sainte Chapelle is next to the major criminal courthouse in Paris, which is still on the island. And on one side, you have the courthouse, and on the other side, behind the Sainte Chapelle, believe it or not, you have the police headquarters. So it's a security check that you go through. And then when you go through that, you come out, and there's a big open courtyard, and the Sainte Chapelle is actually inside that courtyard. So in case, talking practical things, in case you need to have access to toilets, they are in fact in the courtyard down some set of stairs before you actually go into the Sainte Chapelle. So you can take care of all of those kinds of things before you actually buy your ticket, which is at the entrance to the Sainte Chapelle.
What about photography? Is it allowed inside of the Sainte Chapelle?
Photography is not allowed in the Sainte Chapelle. It is one of the few places where it is not allowed. You can take photographs without flashes in some places, but in the Sainte Chapelle, in spite of the fact that it's obviously easy to kind of use your phone and things like that, the signs everywhere do say no photos taken. And just as a quick word about that, I know there's a big temptation, just like there's a temptation when we see beautiful sculpture to want to touch it in places where it says do not touch. But unfortunately, The flash does have an effect eventually on the color in the glass. So if people take photos without the flash and they get away with it, well, that's one thing. But people should just be careful to not take photos with flash anyway.
Very good. What about accessibility and level of fitness required to visit?
Okay, that's a good question. You do need to be able to go up some very steep, narrow steps to see the stained glass windows. The entrance into the bottom part, the lower level of the Sainte Chapelle, is easy. It's down, I think, 3 or 4 steps. But from there, you have to go up a very tightly wound little staircase. There is a banister to hold on to, but it's really only as wide as one human's shoulders. And the steps are a little bit steep. It's not too many of them, but it's the equivalent of going up one full flight of steps. So people should know that. And you go up one side and you go down the other.
Do you know if there's an elevator for people in a wheelchair?
There is an elevator that can be reserved 24 hours ahead of time. So you have to be able to do that ahead of time. And talking about reserving ahead of time, if you wish to do one of the guided visits of Sainte Chapelle, there are 2, one in the morning and one in the afternoon, in French. If you want to do a guided visit to Sainte Chapelle in English, you have to look for special services. There are various tour services and guides. When I go to Paris with people, I take them in and I do a visit of Sainte Chapelle, but I've already got my group with me. It's not a pickup group standing outside the Sainte Chapelle.
What about children? Is this a good visit to do with children?
Yes and no. I'd say that not for young children, no. I mean, there's really nothing for them to understand, and it's not a very big space. It's fairly crowded most of the time. You have to be careful of them on the steps anyway. There's also a little bit of a balcony you can go out onto from the upper level, which gives you a little bit of fresh air. It's protected, but I would say it's not the greatest place to take small children to.
Okay. What about souvenirs and shops?
Has a great gift shop down below in the lower level. Wonderful little artifacts, reproductions of things, reproductions of sections of medieval tapestry, and also, as elsewhere in Paris, a good collection of little books about both the Sainte Chapelle, about Ile de la Cité, and about various things. So it's a nice little gift shop.
Food? There is no food on the premises?
No. This is really a monument. This is to go in. It's like going into any other church. You have to remember doesn't function as a church anymore. There are no services. However, they do have concerts. There are classical music concerts. I think it's 5 times a week, most of the year. And they are in the chapel up above. They're 20 to 25 euros, so it's not cheap, but it's really interesting to do at least once because it's a wonderful atmosphere to be sitting in this chapel surrounded by these gorgeous pieces of stained glass. And to me, the marvel of them is how they managed to do these with such little technique at the time, and they are still standing and still in great condition today. So it is truly one of the most beautiful things to see when you visit Paris.
Well, this brings us to the end of our 3rd Join Us in France podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm sorry that it ends quite abruptly. There was a technical problem with the recording of the end of our conversation, and I couldn't use the audio. Thankfully, I'm learning a lot, and I hope to stop making rookie mistakes like that very soon. You will find a detailed transcript for this episode at joinusinfrance.com, where you can also ask your questions in the comments section. If you enjoyed the podcast, please write us a review on iTunes. We're a very young podcast, and every review we get boosts our morale, encourages us to keep going with this project, and it also helps new listeners find us. Thank you again, Rémi, for wonderful accordion playing. And until next week, au revoir.